All right, thank you, everyone, for joining us this evening at InfidelGuy.com for this special feature presentation. It is a debate between Dan Barker. Many of you know of Dan Barker as a former minister, now atheist. You can check out his website at Freedom from Religion. It's called Freedom from Religion, and it's ffrf.org. And also we have with us Paul Manata. Many of you have heard Paul Manata on Gene Cook's programs over at Unchained Radio. And Paul Manata's blog is at presstheantithesis.blogspot.com. So you can check out that. You can also simply do a Google search and you'll have results as well for both of our debaters this evening. Now, the issue to resolve tonight is which is more rational, Christian theism or atheism. So that will be the issue to resolve. So we'll see what happens here. The debate format is as such. Paul is going to open, of course, with the affirmative, and then Dan is going to, and Dan is going to open as well. And 2 minutes, 10 minutes each side, so 20 minutes total. And then, of course, Paul will cross, Dan will cross, and we'll continue to do that, 20 minutes each side, and then 10 minutes for closing, and then 20 minutes for, questions from the audience. I know that a lot of you want an opportunity to talk to both Dan and Paul, so I'm going to give you guys plenty of time to do that. So please hold off on all of your questions. Please wait until around 8:40. I'll let you guys know, but go ahead and write your questions out. About 8:40, feel free to type those in red in my chat rooms. I have video cam open right now and stick cam, and also the IRC room is up and running as well. And type those questions in red at 8:40, and I will then ask those questions, or whoever you direct it to, both people will still get an opportunity to address those questions. So, without further ado, I guess we'll begin here. Thank you very much, Paul and Dan, for appearing on the Infidel Guy for this debate tonight.
Thanks for inviting us.
All right, well, Paul, open. You have 10 minutes.
Okay, first I'd like to say, by way of introduction, that I'm very grateful to Mr. Finley for hosting and moderating this debate. And I'd also like to thank all of those listening for giving up their time to listen to what I consider to be an important topic. I'd like to take this opportunity also to thank Dan Barker for taking time out of his busy schedule to engage me on this topic. Especially thank my wife and my son for giving up time together so I could prepare for this debate. And finally, and most importantly, I'd like to thank my Lord and Savior, Jesus Christ, the Lord and exemplar of rationality. The resolution of tonight's debate is which is more rational, Christian theism or atheism? My answer will not be that Christianity is simply more rational than atheism. This might strike you as odd, since that's what the debate is about. The question seems to imply that Christianity and atheism could both be rational, just one more than the other. But this position dishonors my Lord and is contrary to my worldview. The Bible claims that it is the fool who says there's no God. Certainly such a position, given my worldview, is not rational. Therefore, my answer will be that atheism is not rational at all, and the Christian position is the only truly rational position. Finally, before answering this question, it's first necessary that I define some terms. And since I'm a representative of Christianity here, I'll need to define what I mean when I speak of Christianity. Very simply, what I mean to defend when I speak of Christian theism is that system of thought which is very nicely summarized in the Reformed creeds and confessions. This is what I take to be biblical Christianity. Thus, any attempts by Mr. Barker to show that Christianity is irrational because of, say, libertarian views of the will be to attack strawmen. Now, Mr. Barker is in the same position, and that's why I'll let him define atheism for us. It should be noted that there are different conceptions of atheism and what that word means. For example, in a blog article, atheist Jeffrey J. Lauder writes, quote, "The atheist movement keeps shooting itself in the foot by failing to reach a consensus regarding the meaning of atheism," unquote. Lastly, we should define rationality. What do we mean by rational? This is not as clear as it would seem. For example, Blackwell's Companion to Epistemology lists no less than 9 different conceptions or meanings of what might be meant by rationality. We can see very quickly how this is the case. I think most people would agree that a rough and ready idea of rationality are beliefs or agents that are formed or guided by legitimate reasoning. But different types of legitimacy are considered appropriate for different types of reasoning. Thus, what is legitimate for correct mathematical reasoning is different than what is legitimate for inductive reasoning or, say, means-end views of rationality. In some cases, what people mean by rational are those beliefs which come from what philosophers refer to as the deliverances of reason. For example, the claim that all bachelors are unmarried is a deliverance of reason because it is self-evident in the sense that once you understand the definition of bachelor, you understand the truth of that proposition. It's true by logical structure. Neither Christianity or atheism seem to be rational in this way, though. Well, I do agree that there are certain paradigms of rationality. Logic, induction, making proper ethical decisions, etc. are all rational things. I think Mr. Barker would agree. At this point, then, we must move beyond the surface and look into which worldview can give an account for these rational practices. This should be obvious, and I'll offer just two reasons for it. One, if the truth of one's worldview undermines any of the above paradigms, then one cannot consistently appeal to them to defeat my worldview. Two, since I deny Mr. Barker's presuppositions and he denies mine, then he cannot use his as a standard to determine that mine are rational. That is to say, assuming that his view and his position is rational and valid and appropriate is simply to beg the question of the debate tonight. And if those reasons were not enough, Mr. Barker himself admits that the debate must be at the level of presupposition. On page 62 of Losing Faith in Faith, Mr. Barker makes the claim twice that debate, to be effective, must be made at, quote, the level of assumption, unquote, and that we should, quote, examine the presuppositional underpinnings, unquote. On page 83 of the same book, Mr. Barker tells us that, quote, epistemology should be addressed before biblical criticism, unquote. And this is what I intend to do. Likewise, Mr. Barker needs to present an epistemology from which he can attack my worldview. So if we cannot assume our presuppositions to attack the others, since that would be begging the question, then how should we seek to undermine our opposition? The only valid line of attack, when ultimate authority is on the line, is to attack the position on its own internal merit. This is known by philosophers as an internal critique. Indeed, on page 53 of Losing Faith in Faith, Mr. Barker recognizes that, quote, all arguments should be weighed for their own sake, based on their own evidences and logical consistencies, unquote. Thus I shall argue that even granting Mr. Barker's own presuppositions for argument's sake, his worldview is internally inconsistent. Interestingly, this line of objection isn't even available for Mr. Barker. Indeed, on page 60 of Losing Faith in Faith, Mr. Barker concedes that, granting the Christian's presuppositions, granting our position, Christianity is internally consistent. He says if our presuppositions are assumed, then our position is logical, granting our position. On the other hand, I maintain that if his positions are assumed, then the paradigms of rationality are undermined. A couple of brief examples of internal problems with Mr. Barker's worldview is when he claims, quote, the scientific method is the only trustworthy way of obtaining knowledge, unquote. Page 133, Losing Faith in Faith. The problem here should be obvious once one asks Mr. Barker how he knows this claim. Not only is it an epistemological presupposition, it's obviously not known by the scientific method. Thus, Mr. Barker's criterion for knowledge, if correct, does not satisfy its own criteria. Secondly, on page 67 of Losing Faith in Faith, Mr. Barker says that the atheist limits himself to the facts which are, quote, observable, testable, and verifiable, unquote. The problem is that this fact is not observable, testable, or verifiable. Neither are the facts of logic, morality, induction. Therefore, I maintain that not only is my worldview internally consistent, and Mr. Barker's is not, but mine allows for and does not undermine the paradigms of rationality spoken of earlier. Indeed, my worldview provides the very ontological and epistemological presuppositions required for those paradigms of rationality, logic, science, and morality to be made intelligible. In my worldview, immaterial, invariant, and normative laws of logic are not automatically problematic. In my worldview, the existence of God and the doctrine of His counsel as controlling all things in the universe is the presupposition which accounts for the uniformity of nature. In my worldview, normative and objective standards of ethics are intelligible because they reflect God's righteous character. Whereas in Mr. Barker's worldview, right and wrong are decided by our thinking. Page 13 in his book, May Be Right, May Be Wrong. But simultaneously admits that, quote, there is something about human nature which makes most of us susceptible to error, unquote. Page 121 of Losing Faith in Faith. Mr. Barker needs to provide a worldview that is internally consistent and does not undermine rationality in order to engage in this debate. This should be obvious since we're debating worldviews, and Mr. Barker has told us on pages 99 and 100 of Losing Faith in Faith that, quote, atheism offers no particular philosophy, no values, betrays nothing of morality or motives. Atheism is no guarantee of kindness, morality, fairness, happiness, or even rationality. Because atheism has nothing to offer and nothing to prove, unquote. At this juncture, it appears that atheism is, according to Dan, at best, non-rational. Therefore, there is no way Dan can prove that atheism is more rational than Christianity. Indeed, since rationality applies either to beliefs or agents, and Mr. Barker has told us that atheism is not a belief on page 99 of Losing Faith in Faith, then rationality cannot be applied to the belief of atheism since there is no belief there. Thus, we see that Mr. Barker has a burden as well. He cannot leave it that atheism is non-rational, since non-rational can't beat rational. If Mr. Barker wants to show that my worldview is irrational, he must first provide us with a worldview that establishes rather than undermines the paradigms of rationality already mentioned. However, I've already demonstrated that his views of reason and knowledge undermine themselves. In summary, I'm arguing that 1. Mr. Barker's worldview undermines the possibility of rationality, 2. Can only be, at best, non-rational, and 3. Has admittedly relinquished any ability to even offer a critique of Christianity. Christian theism alone provides the necessary preconditions of intelligibility, and thus I maintain that Mr. Barker's rejection of Christianity leaves him unable to account for logic, induction, or ethics, and therefore without an apologetic tonight. Thank you.